I think the starting point today has to be that as we sit here in this gathering of people committed to building a better world, committed to promoting the concept of peace and all the principles that underlie that, elsewhere in the world, President Trump has given an order that 2 nuclear submarines of the United States Navy proceed towards Russia in response to the latest public statements by a former Russian leader. That's the world we live in. And I think it really brings home to us that the work that we're doing in ICAN, supported by, I hope, by all of you, is really important work for peace. Let me say at the outset that Susan Templeman, who I inadvertently glanced down and saw out the corner of my eye, has been an absolute stalwart supporter of ICAN in the federal parliament, and I want to acknowledge that. It's also very important, I think, just to set the scene a little bit in order to make some key points about going forward. My partner Annie's here today, and she's the only person who witnessed the visit that we had to Hiroshima, and I'm pleased to say that she's the only one who witnessed it, because what kind of happened to me on that day was a total personal meltdown. You know, I found the visit to Hiroshima to be, for me, the most moving place on the entire planet, and it just reduced me to, you know, to my own emotional, you know, low. But a visit to Hiroshima doesn't, in my opinion, just move you because it's the scene of that horrific event back in 1945. It also moves you because of the deeply profound resurgence of the people and of Hiroshima. And that may seem a funny thing to say, but it was that power of the human spirit, the love of people, for me, that touched me on that visit. I've been involved in this issue for a long time. I'm a country kid. I grew up in Foster and Taree, up on the north coast, and I remember I've got a copy of an old school magazine from Taree when I'm sort of writing about nuclear weapons. But I've been very lucky to have had the opportunity to be engaged in this debate and to see the tremendous breakthrough that has come, that has resulted in the creation of this brand new treaty, this nuclear weapons prohibition treaty, that really does have enormous capacity to change the world for the better. People earlier on alluded to the ban the bomb campaign, you know, back I think in the 50s or the 60s, more like it, I guess. And that campaign's been going a long time. You know, a lot of people campaigning around this issue. But there was a breakthrough in the thinking of people committed to this issue that occurred in the early part of this new millennium. ICAN was formed in 2007 in Melbourne, and it then supported and with others worked for the creation of other organisations with the same name in different parts of the world, and created this grassroots campaign, which was very important, critically important, to bringing into existence the treaty that we all have been talking about today. What also happened, though, around 2009, was that the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross made a public speech in Geneva to the diplomatic community of Geneva, and this is the way in which the International Committee of the Red Cross, if you like, charts a course for the organisation. And essentially, Dr. Kellenberger, who was then the president of the ICRC, spoke essentially calling for a treaty that would outlaw nuclear weapons. In Australian Red Cross, we were the first to get behind this, and it culminated in 2012 in a unanimous resolution of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement in support of the creation of such a treaty. And the great breakthrough that both ICAN and the Red Cross championed, that completely transformed the debate, was to make the point that the world had acted on other inhuman weapons of war that violated the Geneva Conventions and other principles of international humanitarian law. And so the world had acted, for example, to ban biological weapons, chemical weapons. The world had acted to outlaw landmines and later on cluster munitions. You know, these weapons all attack essentially civilian populations as well as people who might be engaged in combat, but they leave such a terrible legacy, as we know, you know, from the work of Princess Diana in all her work and that of others in relation to the landmines issue. But when you get to nuclear weapons, it's an entirely different paradigm. You know, we're talking about the killing of hundreds of thousands of people. We're talking about the poisoning of the planet. We're talking about the impact of what a nuclear war would do in relation to climate change. You know, it is an issue that completely overshadows the threats of all those other terrible weapons of war. And so what occurred internationally was a series of 3 meetings of national governments in Norway, in Mexico, and then in Austria. And representing the Red Cross, I was privileged to go to each of those. But you know, they were the first ever meetings in the history of global gatherings which focused on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war. They were the first meetings. And that's what's absolutely transformed the debate. Now, the Australian Labor Party, of which I was once a member, when I went to Red Cross, I took the view that I needed to be impartial and neutral. I had to engage with the Howard government. I took the view that I'd made my contribution to party politics, and I thought it appropriate that I not be involved in party politics going forward, and I've kept that up. So, as I'm fond of saying quite cheekily, you know, I'm clean, you know, I don't have that involvement. But I say that, and I was about to say, but the truth of the matter is that there are so many idealistic people in the parliament. You'd be amazed, you know, you really would. And our challenge, of course, is to ensure that those people with the idealism and the principle have their voices heard in relation to this particular issue, because that's what will change things. Now, the Labor Party in 2015, through the work of the then Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Tanya Plibersek, inserted a provision in the national policy of the party which was really strongly encouraging of the developments then occurring towards the creation of this treaty, which eventually came into force in 2017. And that was a great, important contribution that Tanya made. But I don't know if you all know this, but this is simply history, and you need to know it. The person who was the champion of getting a commitment in the ALP national policy to sign and ratify the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons was Anthony Albanese. And let me tell you the enormous courage it took. Back then, he was opposed by, you know, very prominent people in the party who said that signing this treaty would threaten the American alliance and would undermine, you know, Australia's foreign policy. But, you know, he stood in the middle of the railway tracks at a conference in Adelaide and he prevailed. You know, the others eventually supported the resolution, but I saw that, and it was heroic, and it's one of the things that, you know, really transformed my view of Anthony. I'd known him a very long time because he was exceptionally close to the late Tommy Wren, as was I, and he learnt his politics and the politics of peace from Tommy Wren, you know, and that's a lesson that those of you who know or knew Tom would know, that you don't forget the lessons. He was a fairly persuasive person, let me tell you. But that's how it got in the policy. So the question is now, you know, the world's moved on. Anthony wasn't the leader then when this was inserted in the policy. He's now the leader, and he has the key role to determine when this policy will be implemented, and indeed if it will. I have faith. I do believe that he is deeply committed to this issue and will support the signing of the treaty. But I guess, you know, I need to say that this is an issue where old friendships, you know, don't count in the sense of the commitment that I have, and that hundreds of thousands of other Australians, and if you believe the polls, something like 70% of our population are committed to. This is an unforgiving issue. You either sign it or you don't. Mm-hmm. If you sign it, you become a Labor legend, you go down in history, you take an enormous constructive step towards a more independent foreign policy for Australia. You leave a legacy for future generations, and you've got that footprint of history that you have changed the country, and let me tell you, and the world for the better. So that's how high the stakes are. I say those things with the greatest respect, as I've said, but at the end of the day, you know, we're in this American alliance, and you know, people will have very different views in this room about that. Maybe a lot of common views on things, maybe have a lot of common views on AUKUS, maybe not, but on that as well. The issue that still has to be focused on is, how do we sign this treaty? Can we do that by still participating in those other things? Now, certainly the view of ICAN is that when you look at the terms of the treaty, and I was looking at it very closely before, what it essentially says is not only would Australia not use nuclear weapons, and we already have actually a national law called the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty Bill, which a very, how do I say, strident backbencher back in about 1985 helped persuade the caucus to enact this law. But the bill, the treaty, I should say, that we want the government to sign and ultimately to ratify goes further than that, because what it says essentially is that Australia will not be encouraging and urging and facilitating someone else, some other country, to use nuclear weapons. So that means there's got to be that really top of government negotiation, which essentially says, you know, that there has to be a clear pathway, and I can believe there is, that whatever occurs going forward, that the use of, for example, Australian bases to facilitate the firing of nuclear weapons has got to be dealt with before we sign this treaty. There's a lot of challenges there, but it can be done. It can be done. Now, I want to end on this note, because if I look around the room, I ask you to think about the things that have been achieved in the lifetime of most people here. You know, there have been some phenomenally wonderful, uplifting changes that have occurred in the world. And we're not by any means at the end of the journey of some of these issues. the shift in the rights of women, the shift in attitudes towards the environment. Here in Australia, the position of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. A long way still to go in advancing rights, but it's transformational compared to the early stages of my life. Change can happen. You can move things along nationally and internationally. And if Australia is to sign and ratify this treaty, it's sending that message to the world. And it's a message that will spread and will encourage other countries, particularly countries that have been caught up in the, if you like, the umbrella protection of the nuclear weapon states. It sends a message to them to get on board, join this treaty. And flowing from that, of course, the pressure for nuclear disarmament that flows from the outlawing of nuclear weapons will become so much more powerful. And that's the way it started. We got rid of landmines, first of all, by outlawing them. And Eric Sidoti is here today, knows that story. Labor in power didn't do that. It was actually the coalition. And we've got to talk to people in all the political parties, in independents. We've got to try and move to a far greater consensus on this. And I think we can do that. But the message that they send, and I end on this note, is essentially that nuclear weapons will not be used in our name ever. Not in our name. Thank you.